Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Child abuse confessions, an odd story. If we had a few more hours together today, I'd probably try to talk to you about a new film starring James Dean that's coming out. I don't know if you've heard about this. If you're anything like my age, you would have had, and you're a boy, or actually no, I think it applied equally, didn't it? You'd have had posters of James Dean on your wall, probably that seminal one of him holding the smouldering cigarette and wearing that, it's a red jacket, wasn't it, with a white T-shirt, although I think the photograph usually appears in black and white, the Rebel Without a Cause poster. How many kids had that on their wall, even though they'd never seen the film? What are you rebelling against? What have you got? Amazing stuff. But they're going to put him in a film with a technologically recreated face. I think there's all sorts of interesting ramifications and repercussions there. But for good or for ill, it is the political landscape that concerns us first. 5 minutes after 10 is the time. I had a bit of a revelation this morning. I caught myself doing something that I have been doing for some time when I'm preparing to come on air. But I suspect it's something that we should all be doing a lot more, particularly during election periods. I read stories about candidates, including this very strong LBC exclusive about the Labour candidate found to have some very toxic comments on his social media history. And also the former radio presenter who worked here for a while, who suggested that women who wanted to avoid being sexually attacked should keep their knickers on. Astonishing intervention, and he somehow ended up on the Conservative candidates list, despite that having been widely reported. The Labour candidate, who remains in post or in place as I speak in Liverpool, also had some of his comments reported as well. So I do wonder what due diligence they actually do sometimes when they're contemplating candidates. But here's what I do, okay? And this is, I just not to be too self-referential, but when I spend a significant part of my political broadcasting time criticising leaders of both major parties now in this country, Jeremy Corbyn's fans would probably argue that I spend a lot more time criticising Jeremy Corbyn than I do Boris Johnson or Theresa May. Boris Johnson stroke Theresa May fans would argue the opposite, which means I think that I'm an honest broker in such matters. I wouldn't be, for the record, if I was inspired or enthused by a political leader. I'd jolly well say so and behave, not during an election period, but the rest of the time I would make it clear where my loyalties lie. But I don't have any loyalties, which is actually quite liberating. But it doesn't, of course, stop people from seeing what they want to see and lumping you in to whatever pigeonhole makes their slightly inadequate understanding of the world stay alive. You know, how do you see politics? Well, it's us versus them. What's he? Is he us or is he them? Well, he's definitely not. He definitely doesn't agree with me, so he must agree with the other lot. Actually, a massive number of people now in Britain don't agree with the Conservative or the Labour position, or certainly don't feel inspired by the leadership of either of the two major parties. And that makes it very easy for me on a day like today to look at these two stories, the Labour candidate in Liverpool and the Conservative candidate with the comment about ladies' underwear, identically. I feel absolutely no struggle or tension in criticising them both and saying that they both have no business in Parliament. I don't actually fully understand why some people find it so difficult to do. It also, of course, as some people have observed this morning, brings us back to Jacob Rees-Mogg's astonishing comments about people who died in the Grenfell Tower tragedy because, according to him, they lacked common sense. And because you tell me why Doreen Lawrence and Jacob Rees-Mogg are on different sides of a political divide. What is that political divide exactly? Why would Doreen Lawrence be on your team and Jacob Rees-Mogg be on mine? Or Jacob Rees-Mogg would be on my team and Doreen Lawrence would be on yours? Jacob Rees-Mogg, of course, famously dined on the invitation of a man who believes that people like Doreen Lawrence should be deported because of their ethnic heritage. But yeah, hey, for the purposes of this conversation, they're equal. It's astonishing, isn't it? So Doreen Lawrence idiotically and outrageously suggested that firefighters who tackled the Grenfell Tower fire were racist, or that there'd been a racist reason for why things went so badly that night. Outrageous, and quite rightly pilloried for it. She then spent time with firefighters. She went to visit the relevant people and issued a full apology. Jacob Rees-Mogg insulted people who died that night and got ordered to apologise, and didn't actually apologise for what he said. He issued a bowdlerised apology for things that he hadn't said, pretending that it was a specific reference to that night, when in fact he talked about what he would do in the event of a fire, not that fire. But it doesn't matter, does it? Because you're already sharpening your cudgels. You're already going, oh, yeah, James is on the other side to me. I'm on the same side as the people who think that Doreen Lawrence should be deported. But I'm too thick to realise. And you don't have to be that stupid. You can criticise both, you know? You can also conclude that Jacob Rees-Mogg has no business in Parliament, any more than this candidate in Liverpool who has used the vilest of language in describing women and, as Nick revealed a few moments ago, has also now found to have issued homophobic comments. There should be rules that apply equally to all. It's also worth reminding you that Dame Doreen Lawrence isn't an elected politician either, so the parallel there is also absurd. But it doesn't matter, you know, you reach for it. I mean, the best bits are when I spend a significant amount of time explaining why Rees-Mogg's comments were so heinous and so egregious. And I glance at my inbox and says, oh yeah, well, why didn't you say anything about Doreen Lawrence? I did a whole hour on it, mate. A whole hour criticising, and with a different tone, because I felt she'd let herself down, whereas in Rees-Mogg's case, I felt his mask had slipped. But a whole hour criticising her. But you can't, of course, acknowledge that. You have to pretend that everybody else is as binary and as bovine as you are, because it's the only way you can make sense of the world. It will all fall apart eventually, but it's the only way you can make sense of the world. If you have a binary bovine worldview, you have to pretend that everybody else does too. So guess what? I think the Labour candidate in Liverpool should step down, and I think the Conservatives were right to get rid of the fella who said that women should avoid or could avoid being raped by keeping their knickers on. I think the bloke in Clacton, was it Clacton, where he called a councillor Shylock and then claimed he didn't realise it was a Jewish reference? He shouldn't just be standing down from his candidacy. He should be sent back to kindergarten. What, Macbeth is Scottish? Good grief. That's astonishing. Othello was black? Wow. Shylock was a Jew? Amazing. So, here's my challenge, and it's a Friday morning. I hope that hasn't come as a major shock to anybody. But it means that we can perhaps have a slightly more, what's the word I want? A slightly more leisurely approach to these stories, as we seek to knit them together. And here it is. What is the rule that we should apply equally to all politicians seeking election? And I don't think we need to extend it to people in the House of Lords or footballers or soap stars or Instagram influencers, whatever the hell they are. People seeking election in our country, either at local level or, for the purposes of this morning's contemplations, at national level. What rule would you put in place? Because I've got a feeling that whatever articulation we settle upon, whatever rule we write down, there's going to be people in both the cabinet and the shadow cabinet, and quite possibly in the front line of some of the smaller parties as well, who wouldn't pass the test. If we were to treat all politicians equally when it comes to offensiveness or offence, what rule? And I might be a little bit over-optimistic in seeking a single sentence, but could we have a crack at that? I'm not expecting the phones to ring off the hook in the first instance, because I haven't quite come up with it yet. But when you read a story about a candidate who is facing calls to step down as a result of outrageous comments that they have made in the past, where are we going to put our bar for when the comments message, or merit is the word I want, when the comments merit dismissal? What is the bar? See, you call somebody Shylock, it's anti-Semitic with reference to a fictional character. Is that worse or better than calling an act, because you offend every Jew potentially when you do that, but is that worse or better than calling an individual identified named female politician the C word? I don't know. I don't know. And if a politician who wears the scarf that you wear does something, why is it so difficult to condemn them if you would condemn a politician who wears a different coloured scarf from you for doing exactly the same thing? I don't understand that. You know, this always leads me back to Brendan Cox, of all people, and the genuine shock I felt on the night that it was reported he faced some fairly serious allegations of inappropriate behaviour. And this sort of weird army of troglodytes on social media bombarded me with abuse, and I couldn't work out why. It was ha ha ha. Like the bloke who rang in and said, I love it when Donald Trump lies to me because I know that it upsets people like you. And I still wrestle with this mindset. If somebody is, if someone's done something disgusting, I don't care what team they play for. You call it disgusting. So I've got two questions for you. Why is it so difficult to do? Why is it so difficult for you to do what I find easy, which is to criticise people for their conduct, regardless of what team they play for? How have we ended up in a place like this, do you think? How have we ended up in a place where it doesn't actually matter what you do? I mean, Donald Trump would be the patron saint of this worldview, wouldn't he? But I honestly thought, perhaps somewhat arrogantly, maybe even sort of mildly racist of me, I just thought British people were better than that. I didn't think we'd fall into these ridiculous traps and pitfalls, but here we are. Why is it so difficult for you? Don't get offended if I'm describing you accurately. Be honest. I hold up mirrors. Don't blame me for what you see. If you are one of those people who thinks that somehow Doreen Lawrence saying something stupid about firefighters is the same as a man who accepted a dinner invitation from an organisation that want to deport Doreen Lawrence, insulting dead victims of the Grenfell Tower tragedy. How have you ended up like that, do you think? What is it that you get from claiming membership of the same team as some of the richest, most right-wing people that British politics has ever seen? But more importantly, what rule could we put in place that would apply equally to everybody? If we kind of appointed an ombudsman, I'd apply for the job actually, if paid enough. If we appointed an ombudsman of public offence, political offence, or public offence committed by politicians, what would that rule look like? So you would say, I don't care what colour their scarf is, I don't care what party they come from. Here is the line. And I may need a little bit of help with this bit. Well, I'm going to need help with all of it, obviously, but Cecil Parkinson springs to mind, okay? A ministerial resignation that had everything to do with personal morality. He impregnated his secretary, tried to keep it secret. It was just a classic news of the world style story, and it ended his political career. He was a darling of Margaret Thatcher, and he was perceived as a future leader of the party. I'm pretty sure, and I was a kid at the time, but I'm pretty sure that Conservative supporters would have been queuing up to condemn him for his moral delinquency. And I don't really need to go much further to illustrate the fact that Conservative supporters today don't seem to care about moral delinquency by their own politicians, but of course they would be in faux outrage immediately if they felt they could land a punch on an opposition politician by adopting a position of outrage. I hope that makes sense. I think this is the most important issue underlying politics at the moment. And it is something I'm trying very hard to write about and struggling because I can't see the wood for the trees. Hopefully today you'll help me out. So where is the line? What is the rule that we could reasonably apply to say if any politician crosses this line here, then they're out of the game? And did you spot the deliberate mistake in the first quarter of the programme this morning? Well done if you did. It was, of course, Marlon Brando, who, in The Wild One, what are you rebelling against? What have you got? What are you rebelling against, Johnny? What have you got? Not James Dean in A Rebel Without a Cause. I'm glad we cleared that up. Where would we put the line? I had the beginnings of an answer, actually, during the break, but I'm more interested in hearing yours first. Andy is in Portsmouth. How do we police the nature of politicians causing offence or saying offensive things in public, Andy? What do you think?
Well, good morning, James. I think basically it's not simple, but it's the protected characteristics. So, for example, anything that offends or goes against the protected characteristics means that you should be called upon to answer those questions, why you said it, and if you can't justify it, then I agree with you. It doesn't matter what party you're with, who you support, whether they're on your team or not. You should step down and be taken to task.
What do we mean by protected characteristics? It sounds like a legal term.
Well, so, for example, within the police, you can't say, or you shouldn't say, anything that is offensive to gay, to do with race, to do with religion. It's that kind of stuff. And there are, I think...
Oddly, I think you should be free to criticise religion. So, again, already we've got a problem. You shouldn't be free to say, kill all the Catholics. But you should perhaps be free to say it's outrageous that the Catholic Church is not cooperating as fully as it could with child sex abuse inquiries.
Completely agree. No, and I use that as an example. I don't. I am completely. I'm an atheist, and I don't have any sort of to any political party either at the moment. I'm very free of what to choose, but. Yeah, the Catholic Church. I can't even begin to start on that.
And I mean, that was just the one I picked because I'm a member of it. So I can't be accused I can't be accused of any animosity or hypocrisy. But of course, I could come up with equally critical observations of all major religions, I suspect.
Well, so you know what?
Go on.
James, you said it earlier as well that I do find you very balanced. Your opinions are very balanced.
Well, except they're not if you're deeply entrenched on either side. You're convinced that I'm deeply entrenched on the opposite side to you because that's what balance has been reduced to. You know, anybody who doesn't completely agree with you must completely agree with the opposition. You and I agree with neither. But I know this sounds offensive, but until someone comes up with a better explanation, they're incapable of... Look, I'll give you an example. James O'Brien being massively hypocritical again. He doesn't realise that he never criticises the Lib Dems. He is as tribal as anyone. What the heck does that mean?
No, I don't, but this is again...
Someone's sitting at home today, or sitting in their mum's back bedroom, or sitting on the bus, and they're listening to this radio show, the same thing you just listened to, and that's what they're tweeting. It's incredible.
Yeah, well, the thing is, James, is that, again, from the world of the police, the one thing that I always used to say to people is the hardest thing to do, be an adult child, wherever, is to admit you're wrong.
Yes,
and a
indeed.
lot of people, magnanimity is massively important, and stepping back and saying, you know what? Yeah, I'm wrong. That person is wrong, and I agree.
And really meaning it. And
yeah,
you know, there'll be some people that will never believe you because they're so entrenched. But that's why we need an objective measure. What about a book? What about a chart? You know, there's like a ministerial code. And I know we ride roughshod over it every day at the moment, but if you had a candidate's code, right, and it got passed in Parliament, and it said, like, we went a little further than you, but it brought in protected characteristics. If you are found to have wished harm upon... then if you break that code, then you're off the list. If you're found to have broken, then ideally they'd check very, very carefully before they put anybody on the list. But if we could make like a 10-point code for candidates, anything in direct and obvious contravention of that code would be a disqualifying event.
And I agree. And the problem is people are scared to do these things because there's grey areas or ambiguity.
And because anything that we put together moving forward would immediately be applied retrospectively, and half the cabinet and half the shadow cabinet would probably be in trouble.
Well, yeah. And again, that's where it comes in where I find you balanced, is the fact that I've listened to your show. You do pull out anyone and everyone that should be called to task, whether they are, gay, straight, Labour, Conservative, doesn't matter. It's a case of looking objectively. Now it's for our country. It's the general election. We're looking at choosing a party. How can you choose a party when you said the word earlier, hypocritical? You look at the Conservative Party pointing the fingers now, saying Labour, these politicians, they shouldn't be allowed. Well, didn't our Prime Minister refer to people in a racist manner?
Well, that's what I mean by wondering whether this genius plan of mine of putting a code together could never work, because everyone would immediately apply it to people who were already in Parliament. But I'm not going to give up yet. I'm not going to give up with my first call of the day, Andy. Thank you, mate.
Nice to meet you, James.
Likewise, and thank you for the kind words and the work that you do. Or did. I think you said you'd retired. 27 minutes after 10 is the time. Hafsa is in St John's Wood. Hafsa, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, I've been... hi, James.
Hello.
How are you?
Very well indeed.
I've been listening since 7 a.m, really, and I've heard Nick Ferrari go through this debate and everything, and I think it's really two things. I think one part of it is generally, a general standard. Nobody has, at any point in time in the conversation in the last 24 hours, I think, or at least from what I've seen, defended the comments. The question is more about, can people be rehabilitated if they have been caught saying
Should they have a
stuff?
second crack of the whip, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be militant about it. My personal belief is no, because I inherently believe people are good, and I think that tens of millions of people in this country have never thought some of the things that have been said in public recently or revealed in public recently, said them publicly or retweeted or posted on social media. So
I haven't got the relevant story in front of me about the Labour candidate because, of course, it's only broken this morning. But
it's quite disgusting.
Yes, it is. It's gross, and it's an LBC exclusive. So
exactly.
the question you're suggesting doesn't become our behaviours deal breakers, but where is the distinction between behaviour that can be forgiven and behaviour that can be that can't be forgiven?
Exactly. And I think also the onus of responsibility lies with the political parties in their selection process. If these people are independent candidates, then that's something, say, for the Electoral Commission to decide in terms of disqualifying factors, if things are incredibly, inciting violence and so on and so forth. But for the parties in their selection, I mean, I applied and very, very almost got a job in the private sector less than 12 months ago here in London, but was eventually turned down because of a tweet I sent in 2015 implying that candidate Donald Trump was inciting racism in his campaign. Now, even though the parties, me and my prospective employer agreed to delete the tweet and agreed I wouldn't tweet ever again about the US president, for example, I still didn't get the job. So if the private sector can thoroughly investigate and, look into it and make a decision
can I ask what sort of job it was, or don't you want to tell me? Because that really surprises me.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit of a complicated procedure. It was in political risk and so forth, and they're an American company, so I don't want to...
Oh, okay. No, fair enough. I mean,
the private sector has the right to set their own rules about, what you can or cannot say.
Well, so does the public sector. It has the right, it just doesn't do it. So what would we do? You've confused me slightly with the talk of rehabilitation. But so what would we put on our list? Because I think we might have shot our fox before it's even out of the blocks, to mix my metaphors horribly. Anything we come up with, some people currently in Parliament would fail.
Yeah, and to be honest, they should. The discourse in the last 5 to 10 years in this country's politics has become absolutely disgusting. Some of the things that we accept can be said in public. Me growing up, I didn't hear on television when I was 10, 15 years old.
No.
At that point. So there is a broader question that we have to address about our own national discourse on issues of race, Islamophobia, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, etc., etc. But for me personally, the Conservative candidate, defending or kind of...
Seeking to lay any blame at all on victims of sexual violence.
It's an illegal, violent act violating...
But that was widely reported. The fellow used to work here. I remember just sort of choking on my muesli when the story was first reported. And so how could he end up getting all the way through a selection process?
Well, that's the problem with the parties. I think they should publicise their selection process. I think they should publicise their rules. We as the public, if you're going to vote or you're a member of one of the major parties or a party for which this person is standing, you should be allowed to read the rules and guidelines of how people are selected, how they're screened, and there should be a procedure of recourse if you want to, if it's your constituency, complain and say, I found this, or, some procedure where you can say, I've seen this, I don't accept this shouldn't be...
No, I hear you, and you're a strong advocate, but I think we both know that we're not getting to the payload here, because the payload is too elusive, and no one is going to vote for a thing that would see half of their own benches emptied. So again, I'd ask, where would we put the bar as we argue over public offence, and as many people, but not all of us, of course, are incapable of seeing offence on our own side, if you have a side, but are absolutely piling in on it when someone who you disagree with politically does it. How do we come up with a rule that applies equally to everybody? Hafsa, thank you very much. It's 10:32. Hi, James, says Ricky in Dundee. The general rule should be that if you think your nan would be offended by the comments, then don't say them, unless your nan is like Catherine Tate's character. So there's always a quibble, there's always a caveat. And if you listen to my rather lengthy introduction this morning, and you heard me cite the example of Joe Cox's widower, Brendan Cox, who was found to have behaved inappropriately, and the suggestions I received are just using me as a lens here, that this would somehow embarrass me or I'd be slow to criticise him, which I couldn't understand for the life of me. But then I realised, because I condemn someone like Donald Trump for boasting about being a sex offender, then I will somehow be embarrassed when someone who apparently aligns with my politics stands accused of much milder behaviour, but still completely inappropriate behaviour. And I mention that to you as an example of how bovine, binary and boneheaded these people are. So I'll read you a text that's come in. I'm tempted to check out the phone number it's come from, actually, just to make sure he's not allowed to operate heavy machinery or I don't know, drive or use scissors. James, did you ever mention your mate Brendan Cox after he had to quietly leave his posts due to allegations of sexual impropriety? Now, there's a very slim chance that's someone doing quite a sophisticated satirical message, right? But I don't think it is. I think it's a complete idiot who doesn't know what day it is. So on what possible context is Brendan Cox my mate? Right? Answer, I was absolutely outraged by the assassination of his wife by a white supremacist terrorist shortly after that Breaking Point poster was unveiled by Nigel Farage. It's the same day. Absolutely disgusted, heartbroken by the murder of a young mother by a white supremacist terrorist. In the same way, I was absolutely disgusted and heartbroken by the Manchester Arena terror attacks, or the July the 7th attacks on the London Underground, or the Finsbury Park mosque murder. You see? Equally disgusted, equally heartbroken. But people like my correspondent here are not equally disgusted and equally heartbroken. They presumably, unless you've got a better explanation for me today, presumably they see an MP being murdered by a white supremacist terrorist, and they see me, people like me, siding with the murdered, and they have chosen the other side. So when you text me to say, did you ever mention your mate Brendan Cox? I think I've met the fellow once, after he had to quietly leave his post due to allegation of sexual impropriety. You're saying, well, there are two sides to the Joe Cox assassination, people on the side of the assassin and everybody else. So you're probably, and I apologise if I've misunderstood your text. I don't apologise if it's a sophisticated satirical text, because, well, I'm not even talking to you. I'm talking to a fictional you. Presumably, you looked at that murder and sided with the murderer. I can't see any other reason why you'd think there's a point to be made, or equivalence to be drawn, or balance to be brought to bear upon the issue. You looked at the assassination of Joe Cox. You saw people, quotes, like me, end quotes, heartbroken and outraged by it, and you thought, oh no, I'm on the other side to him, which means you're on the side of the terrorist. Now, I think you're probably too thick to realise that, but I've explained it in incredibly simple words. Do you know what that is that you're looking at now? That's a mirror. You see? There's the mirror. Anyone who's ever sort of come out with a comment like that, or suggested that if you condemn sexual impropriety by someone whose politics you don't agree with, then you'll be silent. You're describing yourself. What you're saying is, oh my God, here I am, somebody who admires Donald Trump. I am now a person who defends and acts as an apologist for someone who boasts about sexually assaulting women. I have to believe that people on the other side of any political divide are just as morally bankrupt as I am. Otherwise, I won't be able to live with myself. I have to look in the mirror and pretend that what I'm seeing is my political opponent, not me. And there it is. You might have thought I was even exaggerating when I cited that example. And there it is, a text at 10:33 this morning, presumably someone who didn't listen to the introduction and probably lacks the ability to hear what he's just heard. So how do we police political offence? Or politicians or individuals seeking to be elected, saying things that should exclude them from that process? And why have we ended up in a place where so many people would find it so hard to agree to a rule applied to their own side, but they'd reach for it immediately if it was applied to somebody on the, quotes, other side, end quotes. James is in Richmond. James, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Sorry to keep you. I went off on one there.
So, no, not right. I may just be describing the current process, unfortunately.
Go on.
But the reason that I'm calling in is because I think that actually the line has already been drawn, and it's in the general election itself. So we all have a different tolerance and level and trigger. Sorry, let me just get my words right. I'm slightly nervous, James.
Don't worry. You've got all the time you need.
We all have different levels of. Bear with me. Sorry, we all have different tolerances and triggers to offence. And so, if we're too prescriptive with our rules, then at what point does that line? At what point does it stop? So, how small of a level of offence would be caused?
So, whose moral compass should become the public moral compass? So we've all got different attitudes and tolerances. So how could we objectively apply one to everybody?
And the way that we do that is through an election, and you'd hope that the electorate would be more discerning as to who they chose. So if an individual has been offensive or been deemed to be offensive by people within that electorate, then you would hope that they wouldn't vote for them. And perhaps it's not so much to do with the party that they're voting for.
I'm going to argue with you politely because my problem is not about different levels of tolerance. It's about hypocritical levels of tolerance. So I reckon I could police a planet where there's a million different positions applied equally to everybody, but the problem we've got is the hypocritical application of a position to politicians that we don't like, and at free passes when politicians that we do like indulge in exactly the same behaviour. That's my problem.
I have an issue with a politician's accountability for their actions, and I think if a politician has been seen to do something opposite to what they've ran on or anything like that, then I feel like at that point then they shouldn't be able to stay in their positions.
But how would we describe it? So, for example, being racist, and then you point out that the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, has employed the phrase, what was it, pickaninnies with watermelon smiles, or he's compared women to bank robbers and letterboxes. You have a leader of the opposition who questioned why a massively anti-Semitic mural was being taken down from a London street. I mean, this is a genuine observation. In an ideal world, I think we could just about come up with a code of standards for candidates, but I think that a significant number of people already in Parliament would fall foul of it. And that actually, the more I think about it, is quite scary.
Yeah, well, this is why I would hope that individuals who have been seen currently I don't know how specific I can go, but the Labour candidate who's running in Boris Johnson's constituency at this point.
Yes. No, you can't do any of that. Not under Purdah. No, he didn't say anything wrong. That's all right. Sorry. Oh, mate, on my toes. We can't talk about can't talk about constituents or specific constituencies or anything like that.
That's fine. Don't worry.
But if a politician says something and they are of a certain hue politically, it shouldn't be treated as a different moral content, as having a different moral content from a politician of a different hue saying or doing exactly the same thing. And that's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree with that, yeah. So, as I said, like I suppose the only way the current situation is one where the people who select the candidates need to be very effective and
well, I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that, but I mean the problem that we've come up against now. I'm a bit late for the break, James. It's the only reason I'm moving on. Is if we brought in a code, let's remind ourselves of the Nolan Code. I think that's the ministerial code. We'll run through it, and we won't mention any names, but we'll just leave the questions hanging of how many household name politicians we can think of who would be able to look you in the eye and say that they haven't broken any of these standards. But if we brought anything that you brought in for candidates, so calling a Jewish councillor Shylock, this Labour candidate, is that worse than what some people already in Parliament have done? Suggesting that women should keep their knickers on if they want to avoid being raped, is that worse than some of the stuff that people already in Parliament have done? And if you can't categorically answer that question with a negative, no, of course, it's what these new people have done is much worse, then we've got a massive problem in public life. We might carry on with this for a little longer, not least because James makes a powerful point here from rather splendidly named Buntingford. James, I'm a company director and a good, hard-working, intelligent guy. Wait, it's a radio show, not a dating app. But I could never run for public office, and neither could most of the people I know, because we'd all get slaughtered in the press for things we've said offhand. Only the most boring of my friends would have a chance. What kind of representative democracy is that? Stick with this one, James. It's actually incredibly important to sort out. OK. You'd have to give me some examples of what you'd done, and you'd also need to explain to me why you'd left them in a public space. So here's the thing. I choose my words carefully because I don't want to offend anyone I care for. But my Facebook is only for people that I know, right? I don't have any public Facebook. I'm all over Twitter, but Facebook is personal, right? A mate of mine's stepfather, after Jacob Rees-Mogg's comments, went down the road that a lot of ill-informed people... This is a fellow who thinks that we should leave the European Union because there are too many Asians in Rochdale, all right? We all know people like this. And anybody in a vaguely normal universe, this notion of metropolitan elites not knowing what Brexiters are like is just utter pants. But there he is on my Facebook page, claiming that the only reason Jacob Rees-Mogg had to apologise was because of political correctness, right? Now... And some other words that I won't share with you. That would exclude him from... The words that I'm not going to share with you would exclude him from running for office, right? That's why I worry about what you've sent me, James. Because what is it you've done that you think, or you and your mates have done, quotes, offhand end quotes, that you think would exclude you from running for office? You'd have to give me some examples. And then you've got that other issue of private versus public. So is that relevant? So if I'm in a room with 10 people and I say something inappropriate 5 years ago and then I run for office and someone from that room comes forward and claims that I've said something inappropriate, that seems to be not a million miles away from what's happened to Gideon Bull. And then if the thing that I said... Well, he was in a private meeting at work 5 years ago, and he talked about black people. He said that they were pickaninnies with watermelon smiles. I honestly think, in a different universe, that would be curtains. Well, he can't possibly stand. He can't be our candidate. But we have a Prime Minister who said that about people of colour. You see how difficult, possibly impossible. Did I just say possibly impossible? What a lovely phrase. It's almost like something Mary Poppins might have said. Possibly impossible. It's possibly impossible to solve this, isn't it? But we're going to try, because that's what we do on this programme. Gideon Bull has denied calling a Jewish councillor Shylock, but admitted using the term during a private meeting. His defence, to my mind, but this is possibly me being a member of the condescending, sneering metropolitan elite, because I know my way around most Shakespeare plays. His defence was he didn't realise Shylock was Jewish, in which case you'd wonder why the hell he'd ever use the word in any context whatsoever. It's a little bit like claiming that you didn't realise the N-word referred to black people, I think, from where I'm sitting. Shylock was a very stereotypical, slightly more nuanced, perhaps, than some analyses allow, because Shakespeare, he was not a simplistic writer, but a moneylender whose Jewishness was intrinsic to his characterisation and who was prepared to call in a debt of a pound of flesh. Literally, he had his knife and scales ready before Portia made that powerful, beautiful speech about the quality of mercy is not strained. I've already got my Marlon Brandos and my James Deans mixed up. If I've just dropped a ball on Shakespeare as well, then be gentle with... Don't even at me, actually. Don't even at me. But there we are. How hard would it be? And then I've got the Nolan Code in front of me, which are the sort of standards for behaviour in public office. I don't think most of us could name a politician who would pass all 7 of these tests. So how many politicians currently in Parliament would pass any tests that we put in place for newly minted candidates? Tristan's in the Cotswolds. Tristan, what do you think?
Morning, James. Well, I think that I can't believe that we've allowed our standards to drop so low. You're talking about the kind of grey area here and kind of where we would define the bar, but
yeah.
I think we're even a long way from that. I mean, I think some of the things that have been said online over the last couple of years feel quite black and white to me, and I just can't believe that we've allowed a process that people who so clearly are unqualified for public office to be candidates in our political system. And I think that one of the things that, is really sad over the last 20 years. When I grew up in the sort of 80s, being a politician was something to look up to, and we have fallen so far from that. And we can talk about the grey area, but the extremes feel, to have become the norm, and I just don't know how we've ended up at that point.
No, well, I don't. Well, I've got a few theories, but I won't necessarily share them today. But you think back to Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech and the speed with which he was excised from the Conservative Party. He went back to pick up his child. There's a chap called Clem, I think it's Daly, who was the editor of the Express and Star in Wolverhampton and a friend of Powell's. And Powell had left his daughter with this journalist's family while he delivered the speech, and when he went back to collect his child, I think the journalist said, "I never want you to darken our doorstep again." The speed with which Enoch Powell was disowned, I got a horrible feeling that wouldn't necessarily happen today, and we all thought we'd gone forward since then.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I say I've got teenage children, and I used to work for a big international American company. It was a market leader, and as an employee, we were trained to within an inch of our lives. And one of the things that I remember is that we were told that we should not write anything in an email that could be taken out of context and read in a court of law.
Yeah.
And it was a really interesting discipline, because you take half a sentence and you have it read back to you, and all of a sudden that might not have been your intent, but it makes you quite cautious. People don't wake up on a Wednesday morning and suddenly decide that they're going to become an MP. There's generally a process involved, and we say to our children, just think about what you're going to put on social media, and imagine an employer in 5 years' time looking at that, and how would you explain
and
this
is the interesting distinction that perhaps my friend in Buntingford has missed, is that I have said things to my friends in private that are utterly indefensible. I have said things that would make my mother outraged and disgusted, but I would never put them on Facebook or social media, and I wouldn't say them in front of people who would be likely to be offended. Or, when blokes are together, they sometimes almost dare each other to new levels of outrageousness.
Yeah, the locker room stuff that Trump used as a defence, in some of his so-called banter.
Yes, I wouldn't include boasting about sexually assaulting women in that category, but I would include perhaps saying things about women's physical attributes in that category. The idea that I would do it either in front of someone I didn't know very well, like Trump did in the back of the car with that journalist, or in front of women, or that's private behaviour, which I think is going to be judged slightly differently from public behaviour. People don't realise that social media is public behaviour, do they?
Well, and we can talk about the grey area, but it shouldn't be that hard to define some absolute basics.
Go on then.
Well, being clearly inciting violence, right? So you talk.
Well,
about
that's already a problem. That's not. So that doesn't work. You can't clearly incite violence. You're already going to get prosecuted. If you were found to have said, go and kill all the Catholics, you're not going to get on a candidates list.
Language, though, the C word, the N word,
the N word would be a deal breaker already. The C word, probably, but not in this case. And I can't think of any MPs actually in Parliament that have been found to have transgressed in that way.
No, that's true, but I think that, so there's a continuum.
And also, hang on, what if you're describing, I don't know, Peter Sutcliffe? What if you're using the C word to describe someone widely considered to be repulsive and repellent, you see, as opposed to using the word to describe a political opponent? So already, I'm not being the devil's advocate or even pedantic. I'm being very sincere. I would initially say, yeah, you're right. Anyone who uses the C word in public gets a coating. But what if you're using it to describe Hitler?
Yeah. Well, and this is where I think we need a bit more of a kind of a calm, grown-up debate about this stuff, which seems to be beyond our ability as a nation at the moment. Which
it does, actually.
Play the ball, not the player, right? So, if you're in the blue team and, somebody in the red team is, saying things you clearly disagree with, attack the substance. Why do you have to attack the person? And clearly that could be a distinction, right? So, there might be lots of policy areas that I may agree or disagree with.
Yeah.
It doesn't make the person who's coming up with the policy or who's delivering the narrative AC or any of the other words that I might choose to describe them. So, why have we moved away from debating the substance and the issues and the policy and focusing on the individuals?
I presume that the answer to that, the shallow answer to that, or the simplistic answer to that, is business models. And the old adage that I use a lot about it being a hell of a lot easier to sell tickets for the ghost train than it is for the Speak Your Weight machine. Except, of course, that ghosts don't exist. So where will all that anger and fear go, that very lucrative scaremongering and fearmongering, where will it go when it becomes clear that the thing you've been told to be angry and scared of doesn't actually exist? I don't know. Maybe I'm bringing too much into it. It's 11:01. Still one each, as far as I can tell. One Labour candidate has stood down. One Labour candidate has stood down after using the word Shylock in a meeting when he was a councillor, and one Conservative candidate has stood down after suggesting that women should keep their underwear on if they want to minimise their chances of being raped. But we shall be keeping an eye on developments. I'll be astonished if they are the last. The fellow that LBC has unearthed some particularly toxic public statements from remains, I think, on the list, the Labour candidate Ian Byrne. But, I love it when we actually stumble upon unexpected discoveries during our time together, because the real problem here, old clever clogs coming on at 10 o'clock in the morning and saying, let's assemble a code of conduct. The real problem here is it's very hard to imagine a code of conduct that is both effective and fair, which many current members of Parliament would all pass. So you see, so you say, why aren't we going to fix this? Answer, because any solution to it would retrospectively exclude X number of MPs already in Parliament from ever having run for office in the first place. It's an odd one, isn't it?